This is a 6-core, 12-thread CPU that costs just $10. I'm going to use it to build a budget gaming PC and run some modern AAA games on it to see if this is actually the cheapest gaming PC I've ever built. Let's get started. So here we have the CPU, and no, it's not a Core i. What I'm holding here is a Xeon. As you probably know, Intel has made a lot of Xeon CPUs with a huge number of cores and threads. Normally, these chips aren't meant for everyday use or gaming. However, Intel also made some Xeon CPUs that share a similar architecture to Core i processors, with fewer cores but higher clock speeds. And that's exactly why this chip is in today's video. And here it is, sitting right inside this box. You might be thinking, I'm using a Ryzen 9? No, not at all. What I'm actually using here is a Xeon E5 1650V2. It has 6 cores, 12 threads, with a base clock of 3.5 GHz. In the roughly $10 price range, this is one of the highest clocked Xeon CPUs you can find. That said, besides its strengths, this chip also has quite a few weaknesses. And those are things not a lot of people talk about. I'll get into that a bit later. You can find this CPU on eBay for a very cheap price. But honestly, the supporting parts that go with it aren't cheap at all. So I'm going to show you a way to get those parts for a lot less. To support this CPU, I'm going to choose the most suitable parts so it can really stretch its legs. Next up, we need a motherboard. I picked up this one for a pretty cheap price. It came very well packaged with plenty of protective padding inside. This is an X79 motherboard in the green version. It's an OEM board made in China. I paid $33 for it, although there are quite a few sellers asking more for the same thing. To keep the cost down, this board cuts a few corners. However, it still comes with an M.2 slot, so storage speed really isn't something we need to worry about here. The downside of this motherboard is that it doesn't support overclocking and it only runs DDR3 memory. Now, I'm going to install the CPU onto the motherboard. Right now, I have two 16GB RAM sticks here, for a total of 32 GB, running at 1600 MHz. I'm going to install both of them onto the board. This X79 motherboard has 2 RAM slots, one on each side. One slot is keyed in one direction, and the other one is oriented the opposite way. Now let's move on to the GPU. Originally, my plan was to go with a GTX 1660 Super or a GTX 1660. However, after testing quite a few different Xeon CPUs and getting some real-world experience with this platform, I realized that high core count Xeons tend to bottleneck most GPUs. So this time I decided to go with a slightly more powerful graphics card, the RTX 2060 Super. The card I have here is a Gigabyte RTX 2060 Super with 8 GB of RAM. Performance-wise, it's about 29% faster than a GTX 1660 Super. Now let's move on to the rest of the parts. I've got a 1TB NVMe SSD here. This drive already has Windows 10 installed, along with a bunch of popular games. Next up, we have the power supply, a Gigabyte 650 watt unit, rated 80 plus bronze. This PSU delivers fairly stable power, runs cool, and doesn't waste too much energy. To keep the CPU cool, I'm using a 4 heat pipe air cooler from Thermalright. It's a budget cooler, but it performs reliably. And finally, we're going with a simple case from Xigmatech. To give it a bit more color, I'm adding an RGB case fan. Now it's time to put this whole build together inside the case. First, don't forget to install the I/O shield. Next, we apply thermal paste. I'm drawing a fairly large X on the surface of the CPU, and then mounting the cooler on top. This motherboard already comes with a mounting bracket, so there's no need to install any extra hardware, similar to some older AMD motherboards. Finally, we install the GPU, plug in all the necessary power cables, and that's it. The build is complete. Alright, now let's power it on. And luckily we get a display right away. I'll quickly check to make sure the system is detecting all the RAM and that the GPU drivers are installed properly. All the RAM is detected and the drivers are fully installed. Next, I'm going to check the performance of the Xeon E5-1650V2 using CPU Z. At the moment, it's scoring 289 in single core and 2287 in multi-core. What about the GPU? Let's run a benchmark. And the result is the GPU scores 4,154 points with an average FPS of around 164. The Witcher 3 was tested at 1080p using high settings. During gameplay, FPS stays stable around 75 to 80, even in combat scenes with heavier visual effects. CPU load remains under control, indicating there's still some performance headroom. For a story-driven game like The Witcher 3, this configuration delivers a smooth and consistent experience. Next up is Tomb Raider, tested at 1080p using the Ultimate preset. Frame rates sit around 170 to 180 FPS. In more complex scenes, performance does fluctuate slightly and isn't perfectly consistent. In this title, the workload leans more toward the GPU, so CPU usage stays at a moderate level. Moving on to GTA 5, I'm running the game at 1080p with very high settings. During gameplay, frame rates tend to fluctuate and aren't as consistent as in some of the previous titles. This behavior is quite noticeable in practice and is a common limitation seen on older Xeon CPUs when handling games like GTA V. Next, I'm moving on to a few more CPU-demanding titles. For Cyberpunk 2077, I'm running the game at 1080p using medium settings. At this point, CPU usage typically sits above 70%. Frame rates stay above 100 FPS for most of the gameplay. However, during gunfights with heavier visual effects, CPU usage can climb past 80%. That said, at these settings, the system is still perfectly usable for casual play, especially for players who aren't chasing high frame rates. Next up is CS2, tested using medium settings. During gameplay, FPS consistently stays above 100. At the same time, CPU usage sits around 30 to 35%, showing that the Xeon E5-1650V2 still handles esports titles like CS2 fairly well. That said, frame pacing isn't quite as consistent as what you'd see on newer Core i CPUs. Still, based on the overall experience, this setup feels solid and is more than capable of handling esports games. Next up is Fortnite. I tested the game at 1080p on medium settings. FPS mostly sits around 70 to 80, and in some moments it can jump past 100 FPS. That said, the frame pacing isn't the most stable. You do notice some dips, especially during fights or fast movement. But overall, for a game like Fortnite, the Xeon E5-1650V2 actually holds up pretty well. If you're new to Fortnite or just playing casually, this setup is totally reasonable and delivers a perfectly playable experience. Next up is Minecraft. I'm playing at 32 chunks with fancy graphics settings. FPS ranges between 70 and 100, but overall, frame stability isn't great. When triggering TNT explosions, frame rates drop significantly, sometimes falling to around 6 frames per second. Honestly, at these settings, this setup is only suitable for light, casual Minecraft gameplay, rather than performance-heavy scenarios. And finally, we have Valorant. I'm running the game on high settings. FPS consistently stays above 110, and during movement, frame rates can climb to around 140 FPS. In this title, CPU usage remains at a moderate level, showing that this setup handles lighter esports games like Valorant quite well. So overall, the Xeon E5-1650V2 isn't really a true gaming CPU. When paired with a powerful enough GPU, it can still run quite a few modern games. but the experience varies a lot from title to title. FPS isn't always consistent, and that's a clear limitation of an older Xeon CPU. So before deciding to build or buy a setup like this, it's worth thinking carefully to avoid unrealistic expectations. If you found this video helpful, make sure to drop a like and subscribe for more real-world hardware tests like this.